Each time you start an EC2 instance, you must decide how it will run in the actual physical space that Amazon provides. And you can choose tenancy or ownership between shared, dedicated instances or dedicated hosts. So, we need to understand what these different models are and what they really mean for your deployment. The first one we'll look at is shared tenancy to understand exactly what it is. Now, to begin with, let's take a look at an illustration of what shared tenancy might look like. So, with shared tenancy, the way to think about it is that you actually have one physical host and multiple organizations are running instances on the host. For example, you might have one organization using 2 CPUs and 8 gigabytes of RAM, and another organization using 4 CPUs and 8 gigabytes of RAM on the same host. So, this is just an example of how that might work. Now, actually, in the AWS cloud, there may be hosts that are able to run 15, 30 or more instances because they have very powerful servers that can host many more instances in this tenancy model. So, it's very important to understand that you're actually sharing physical space with other tenants. That means that multiple customers are sharing time and space on this same physical host. It is not dedicated to your instances or any instance for that matter. It is also important to know that unless you select it differently, this is the default instance behavior. It is the way it will work with all instances you deploy. Now, when it comes to tenancy, there are some pros and cons to think about in relation to this. First of all, in pros, the costs are reduced. It will be cheaper than having the dedicated host or a dedicated instance. The other pro is that the implementation is simpler. You don't have to think about where your EC2 instance will be deployed. You just deploy it and Amazon takes care of the rest. All it really does is choose an availability zone where the instance should be. And then Amazon decides exactly what physical host it will be on and who it might share that physical space with. The downside, however, is lower performance. When you have a dedicated host, you have the ability to decide what runs on that dedicated host. You don't get that with tenancy. It gives you less control, particularly at that physical host level. And this is one of the areas to think about with shared tenancy. There may be some regulatory compliance issues that require certain implementation models on the physical host so that you can claim that you're achieving a specific government level of security, or maybe some regulatory agency within a particular industry, such as payment card processing that specifies certain things about the physical host. If that's the case, you may be forced not to use shared tenancy. But if you can use shared tenancy, it will reduce your cost. So, in closing, it's very important to keep in mind that the default configuration for the tenancy model is shared tenancy when you launch your EC2 instance. So, be sure to keep that in mind when thinking about what the default is. The vast majority of instances that are launched on AWS are tenancy instances because of the reduced cost. So, if you don't have some performance constraint or regulatory constraint or policy constraint in your organization that forces you to use a dedicated host or dedicated instance, then shared tenancy is likely to be more prevalent. It can give you good performance, although not as good as the dedicated host, and it can reduce your costs considerably.